Good morning. It's me again. I told you all last time that this was the day I was supposed to preach for John, and when he got sick a couple of weeks ago that I filled in. But unfortunately, this week has been kind of unique for me. I've had a very serious case of, I'm going to call it writer's block. It's really not. Father's Day is an important day for me, but it's also, this year's been very difficult for me for reasons I really won't go into. But I tried very hard to write a Father's Day sermon, and I just couldn't make it work. So yesterday morning, I was going back through the passages that we had read during the week, and I came across one of my favorite passages in 2 Samuel. And so the sermon just wrote itself. So it's not a Father's Day sermon. I'll start by saying that. But to make my wife happy, I'm going to tell a joke. And there's a story behind that, and someday I'll tell you all that story. But I'm going to start with a Father's Day story and end with a Father's Day story. So even though the middle is not about Father's Day, at least I've covered my bases. So many, many years ago, there was a young man who was going to South America to be a missionary for about 2 weeks. And he had been studying the native language for some time, but he just wasn't quite getting a hold of it. He couldn't quite get the dialect right. He couldn't quite keep up with people that he knew that spoke the language that fast, and he had a very hard time with it. So it was very difficult for him, and he went down to this country not knowing exactly how he was going to communicate. And he gets there, he has some issues with his plane, and so he gets in late Saturday night, and he doesn't have time to touch base with the minister at the church. And Sunday morning he gets up and he pulls out his map, and sure enough he gets lost on his way to church. And he gets to church just as everything's about to start, and the church is packed full of people except for one seat in the very front row. And so this guy kind of slides in. He doesn't have time to talk to anybody. He doesn't have any time to find out what's going on. But he decides that this gentleman that he is sitting next to, whatever he does, whatever this gentleman that he's sitting next to does, he's going to do. So if he stands up, he's going to stand. If he sits down, then he's going to sit down. And right before the minister is about to speak, he says something. And the gentleman sitting next to the new missionary stands up. And so the guy, not knowing what was being said, stood up with him. And there was a big gasp that went through the entire room. And so he got very nervous and he sat down real quick. And the gentleman looked at him for a minute, kind of quizzically, and then they both sat down. And when everything was over, the sermon was done, and the last song had been sung, the young man walked up to the minister and he introduced himself, and the minister said, "Well, I knew you had to be our missionary friend come from the United States." And the young man said, "Why was that so obvious?" He said, "Well, right before I got ready to preach my sermon, I told the congregation that the Ramirez family had just welcomed a new child into the family and asked the father to stand up." That's a dad joke, by the way. I have lots of them because I am a dad, but that's my dad joke for the day. 2 Samuel chapter 6 is where we're going to pick up the story. This week, you have been reading, if you've been keeping up with the weekly reading, you've been reading about David officially becoming the king of Israel. Last week, John talked about how he had been anointed king, but was not officially king yet. Well, Saul has decided that things are getting bad. He doesn't know how to handle being king, and so he goes to visit a medium, the Witch of Endor, not where the Return of the Jedi was based, but an actual city named Endor. And he visits this witch and asks her to call up the spirit of Samuel, and Samuel gets very upset that Saul has called him to do this. And Samuel the ghost of Samuel basically tells him that he's about to be defeated, that God has already selected a new king. Saul goes into his final battle. He's defeated, killed, and David is officially king. Now, the Israelites and the Philistines had this ongoing rivalry, and as most good rivalries will do, they had a trophy, but not the kind of trophy that you would think of. Their trophy was the actual Ark of the Covenant that Moses had built, the box that held some of the manna, that held the staff of Aaron and the 10 Commandments. They traded this thing like it was a trophy, so whoever won the battle got to take the Ark of the Covenant with them. Reminds me of when I was growing up in high school. We had a similar rivalry with a neighbor school of ours. We had a little wooden hatchet plaque that we traded. Unfortunately, when I was in high school, they kept it way more than we did. But it was a big deal when we won it. We won it once while I was in high school, I think maybe twice. We played twice a year. We played at our place and their place, and we got it once, maybe twice, the whole time. But that was a big deal. I remember the night we won it back for the first time. It was a huge deal. And so you can imagine that here the Israelites and the Philistines are fighting over this trophy, and it's way more important to the Israelites than it is the Philistines, right? The Philistines couldn't care a lick about this gold box. All they knew was that it was important to the Israelites, and so if they took it, it would give them some kind of influence or power or psychological advantage or whatever you want to call it. And so when we come to chapter 6, David has once again defeated the Philistines, and he has gone to bring the Ark of the Covenant home. And while they are marching the Ark of the Covenant back, they're having a grand old celebration. There's music and singing and just all kinds of great things are going on. The Ark was loaded on a cart that was pulled by some oxen. Now, you weren't allowed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. For those of you that don't know, there were golden poles, gold-covered poles. It had 4 rings, one on each corner, and this pole was slid through those rings, and that's how it was lifted and carried. You were not supposed to touch the Ark of the Covenant no matter what. It was forbidden. You didn't touch it. Well, this cart is going along. There's singing, there's dancing, there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on. And one of the oxen happens to stumble. I don't know if he stepped in a hole. I don't know if he just lost his foot or what. But the cart starts to tip, and the ark starts to slide off the cart. And as any good person guarding or carrying this thing would do, one of the men named Uzzah reaches out to catch the ark. And when he does, as soon as he touches it, God gets mad and strikes him dead right there. And David is obviously, he's just mortified. He's like, what happened? What's going on? I don't want anything to do with this ark anymore. I don't want it anywhere near me. I'm not taking it another step. And so he finds a local man who has my favorite name in the entire Bible. The first time I preached this sermon, Betsy was pregnant with Parker at the time, and I told the church that if I'd had my way, my son would be named after this guy in the Bible. His name was Obed-Edom. And Parker is very thankful that he did not get named Obed-Edom. He's very glad that I did not have much of a say in what name he got to have. But Obed-Edom is living in the area. He's minding his own business. He's minding his sheep and everything else. And the king of Israel walks up with this Ark of the Covenant, and he says, you know what? We're not taking this back to Jerusalem. It's going to stay here with you because it's dangerous and we don't want to mess with it. Now, put yourself in his shoes for just a minute and ask yourself, how would you have reacted if the king had come to you and said, we want you to take care of this precious thing, but it's dangerous. We don't want to have anything to do with it. We'll put it in modern terms. President Trump knocks on your door one day with the briefcase that holds the nuclear codes to all the missiles in the world. And he says, here, I want you to hold on to this because we're terrified that somebody might get a hold of it. And we're not sure what would happen if somebody did. You'd be flabbergasted, right? You'd be like, I don't want it. If it's dangerous, if it's going to kill me, if I touch it, if I look at it wrong, if I breathe on it wrong, something bad's going to happen to me. Well, Obed-Edom, being the good man that he was, took the Ark of the Covenant into his house, or into his whatever, into his barn. He kept it safe, he kept it protected. And the Bible says in 2 Samuel chapter 6, it tells us that God blessed Obed-Edom and his household for the 3 months that the Ark of the Covenant was there. And so word gets back to King David that all of a sudden the Ark of the Covenant has become this great blessing to Obed-Edom, and David decides, okay, maybe now it's safe to take it back. Maybe God's not angry anymore, and so let's go get it and bring it back to Jerusalem. Now, this wouldn't really make much of a sermon if we didn't really look at the difference in those two trips. If you have your Bibles with you, turn to 2 Samuel chapter 6. I'm going to read verses 13 and 14. And this is right after David is told that Obed-Edom has been blessed by having the ark in his house. And it says, and so David and his people have gone back to get the ark. In verse 13 it says, and when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. Now, if you back up just a little bit at verse 5, it says, and David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. So what's the big deal? What's the difference in the two trips? Well, first of all, and we're going to look at each of these in depth, but I want to tell you what the 3 main differences that I see in this one are. Number 1 is the second trip involved a blood sacrifice before the ark had gone very far. The first trip back, there's no mention that David had any kind of sacrifice made before the ark went very far. The second thing is not so much the music or the type of music that was being played or the instruments that were being played, but maybe the attitude of the people when they were coming back, and we'll talk about that one. And the third one is the way David was dressed. Now, hold on, all right? I am not going to get up here in June and start a sermon about how you should all be dressed, okay? Don't put that right out of your mind, okay? But that's the difference. Because in the first trip, there's no mention of David being dressed in this linen ephod, okay? So what's really the difference here? And you're going to find this funny. This probably should have been a sermon that Chad preached. Coming from me, it doesn't, maybe it carries more weight. I don't know. Worship has to be at the center of everything that we do. And worship is the difference, I think, in these two trips. And we're going to talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. But if worship is not authentic and genuine and true, then it's not going to produce any results. Okay, so number 1 is true worship remembers the blood sacrifice. Now, I tried to look this up to see if it was a requirement that a blood sacrifice be made every time the ark was moved, and I couldn't really find anything. Those of you that know that section of Scripture better than I can correct me if you want to. But I couldn't find anything where it was absolutely commanded that a blood sacrifice had to be made. It makes pretty good sense, though, if they were going to move the ark, if they were going to move this holy relic, the thing that represented the place where God sent His Spirit to dwell when the Israelites were wandering in the desert, it was the Ark of the Covenant that was set up in a tent where He would come and rest His Spirit on while they were traveling. It was the Ark of the Covenant where the blood of the sacrifices was sprinkled by the priests in order to atone for sin. The Ark of the Covenant was a central part of their worship. And when David and his men pick it up from the Philistines and they're on their way back to Jerusalem with it, it seems like they've forgotten how important that item is. All of a sudden, it seems to me like it was just a trophy of the battle that they had won. And here we are, we get to bring the great Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. Won't everybody be happy and proud of us? And they've totally forgotten that it was a blood sacrifice, that it was a symbol of the sacrifices that were made on their behalf. So when we come every Sunday to church, that's why we remember the blood sacrifice that was made for us. I don't know about you, but I'm very glad that I don't live in a time where a blood sacrifice has to be made every time I want to have atonement for sins. It's gross. I'm just going to be honest. Those of you that have either skinned or have watched an animal be skinned and cleaned, it's not pretty. We would have to do that outside. We'd have to do something with the remains. It's just, right? Nobody wants to do that. Well, we don't have that problem anymore. The Bible tells us that when Jesus died on the cross, he died once for all so that all sins could be forgiven. One blood sacrifice to take care of all sins. So we don't have to offer a blood sacrifice, but we always have to remember the blood sacrifice. I've said it 100 times. I've heard Chad say it. I've heard Robbie say it. I've heard John say it. Communion is probably the most important and should be the central part of your worship. Because if you don't remember that sacrifice that was made for you, everything else that you do in this room is almost meaningless. Just like carrying the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem was meaningless because they had forgotten its significance. Now, some people will argue with me that if you take communion every Sunday, that it loses its significance, it loses its meaning. All you're doing is just, it's a repetitious thing that you're doing. And I say, well, you're right if you allow it to be that. If you take the time to honestly remember the sacrifice that was made, if you honestly take the time to remember why it is that you do what you do, it doesn't lose any of its meaning. I've been in church since I was 11, 12 years old. A lot older than some, younger than a few. Taking communion most of my adult life every Sunday. And I can count on one hand, maybe rolling into a second one, of times that I have not taken it for whatever reasons. And it's usually because I'm not in a place where I'm actually physically, mentally remembering the sacrifice. And so I don't want it to lose its significance. So David remembers the blood sacrifice. Again, whether it was something that was taught to him, whether it was something that was required by the law, it really doesn't matter. He thought it was important enough before that thing had gone 7 steps to make a blood sacrifice, to offer that trip as an act of worship. All right, number 2, true worship focuses on God. Now, that sounds obvious, right? That's one of those duh moments, right? Okay, but go back to that first passage where it talks about all the musical instruments that are being played, right? What does it say in the second trip? That they went back with shouting and the sound of horns. Now, again, brace yourself. I'm not up here to tell you that musical instruments are bad and shouldn't be used in worship, because that's not the case at all. If there had been no musical instruments the first time and 100 musical instruments the last time, I wouldn't tell you that that's justification for using musical instruments. What I'm saying and what I'm proposing to you is that the first trip was more a celebration of the earthly victory, not what God had done for them. Imagine a bunch of soldiers gathered around this trophy, if that's what they've decided it is. The types of songs that they're going to sing are going to be celebrations of the victories that they have won. They're not necessarily going to focus on the one who gave them the victory. Do y'all remember who the Philistines are? Their champion, Goliath. Y'all remember that story? He was 9 feet tall. Okay, I don't think he was an aberration. I think the Philistines were way bigger than the Israelites. I think they were way better trained for battle. I think they were way better equipped than the Israelites to go into battle. The Israelites did not win a single victory over the Philistines, in my opinion, without the help of God. Because every time they got routed and defeated was usually because they had not honored God in their battle. So I don't think it's a coincidence that they're celebrating their great victory and how wonderful they are. And let's break out all the musical instruments and let's sing these great songs about how great we are. You know, the Bible says in that first trip that the anger of God was kindled by them. Now, it happens to say that it was kindled right before Uzzah reached out and grabbed the ark, so we all naturally assume that he was mad because somebody touched the ark. That's not the kind of God I serve. I think he was mad at the whole process. I think they had totally forgotten why they were there in the first place. So true worship remembers the blood sacrifice. It makes God the very center of its worship. Because without that, everything else is meaningless. And I will tell you that. If God is not at the center of your worship, if he is not the only reason you are here today, then everything that you're doing is worthless. Now, I've been here. I will be very honest with you. I have been here on days where God was not at the center of my worship. Okay? And I can tell a difference. It happens. Right? Don't beat yourself up if you're here today and you think, oh, gosh, I didn't put God at the center of everything that I did today. Well, a lot of times we don't. But if he's not the reason and the focus behind why you are here, then it's meaningless. The moment you walk in those doors, you're here. Everything that you do, everything that you say, every song that you sing, every prayer that you pray, every word that you hear come out of my bumbling lips is for God. You're not here because the sermon's good, even though it is. Judy B., that one's for you. She always tells me, don't be so hard on yourself. You do a good job. So you're not here because the sermon's good, even though it is. You're not here because the music's good, even though it is. You're not here because your neighbors are pretty, even though they may be. Or they may not be, I don't know. But you're not here for any other reason than that God should be at the center of everything that you want to worship. And if it's not, you have misplaced priorities. Okay, the last one is the one that may scare you, but I'm going to say it anyway. True worship doesn't care what it looks like. True worship doesn't care what it looks like. In the first trip back with the Ark of the Covenant, there's no record of what David was wearing. Now, that does not lead me to believe that David was naked bringing the Ark of the Covenant back. It leads me to believe that he was probably still dressed in his armor from the battle. Maybe, maybe not. But the second trip specifically mentions the linen ephod that he wears. Now, if you know anything about the priestly order, the linen ephod was basically an undergarment that they wore. It was basically what they wore as an initial covering over their body before they put on the rest of their priestly garb. In modern terms, it would be, it would be his drawers. Thank you, Robbie. It'd be his underwear, right? And everybody would go, oh my gosh, David's running around in his underwear. David didn't care what he looked like at that moment. All he wanted to do was honor God with what he had. David was not a priest, okay? He was not from the line of Levi. He was not ordained to be a priest. But the only way that he knew to honor God in that, as close to that as he could, was to wear this one-piece linen ephod that he wore. And it says that he danced in front of the Ark of the Covenant all the way home. And he danced through the city streets, basically in his drawers, for everybody to see. It didn't matter what he looked like. It didn't matter what he did. He did not care. And his loving wife, when she saw him, made fun of him and told him that he was making a spectacle of himself because of the way he was worshiping God. And he says, if I can find it, because I didn't make a note of this one. Oh, thank you. Verse 20. I'm going to start in verse 20. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, see, there's his first problem, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers themselves. Now, if you can't read sarcasm in that, there's a lot of sarcasm in there. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes, but by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. In other words, David didn't care what he looked like. He didn't care if his hands were waving in the air. He didn't care if he was dancing through the streets. He didn't care what it looked like. And true worship doesn't care what it looks like, whatever form it takes. Now, I grew up in a church that was very conservative. Can I say that? Conservative? That's probably an understatement. We had a piano and an organ. We sang 3 songs. We prayed. We sang another song, we prayed. We had a sermon. Oh, well, there's communion in there too. And the sermon and prayer and song. The format didn't change. Only the page numbers changed. We didn't clap. We didn't raise our hands. We didn't do any of that stuff. And that's a very hard model to break when you've been raised in that. But take me out of that context and put me in a group of teenagers, 2,000 teenagers in an auditorium, and they're all dancing and singing, and I'm standing there going, what are you people doing? We've gotten to the point where it's gotten a little easier. It's not as easy as it should be, but it's gotten easier to let myself go on some of that stuff. But true, honest worship doesn't care what it looks like. It doesn't matter if you feel the urge to get up and raise your hands. It doesn't matter if you get up, get the urge, the Spirit moves you to clap your hands. It doesn't matter any of those things. What matters is that it's honest and true worship. I'm going to close with a story, and I promised you this was a Father's Day story, and it kind of is. There was a young man, high school age, about 15 years old, had moved to a new town. He had to move in with his aunt because his mother had passed away. His dad was out of the picture, and his name was Michal. Michal was a very reserved and kind of surly young man. He didn't like to talk in youth group. He didn't like to do anything. And being a former youth minister, if you've and Kyle can probably attest to this, if you have had kids in your youth group that don't want to do anything, you don't even try to make them do anything. You just, if they feel the urge to participate, you're like, wow, he's going to participate. That's great. But it came about October, November, and they started making plans for their Christmas program. And they were decided as usual, they were going to do the story of Mary and Joseph and the wise men and the shepherds. And they started listing out parts, and everybody picked their part. And the youth minister came to Michal, and he said, okay, Michal, what part do you want to play? He said, I don't have much left, but whatever you want to do, I'll squeeze you in. And Michal looked at him and said, I want to be a wise man. And the youth minister kind of sighed under his breath and thought, okay, how am I going to handle this? I've already got 3 wise men. He said, well, Michal, I've already got 3 guys that want to be wise men. He said, I'm not going to tell you can't be. He said, but you're going to have to bring your own gift because we only have props enough for 3 wise men. And Michael said, okay, fine. And so that Sunday came around, and of course the youth minister was very nervous. He didn't know if Michael would even come, because sometimes Michael came and sometimes he didn't. And that Sunday morning, Michael came in, and sure enough, he had his gift. He had a little box. And so the youth minister kind of had to scramble a little bit because he didn't have a costume for another wise man. So they improvised a little bit, made do. So sure enough, that Sunday morning on the stage, there were 4 wise men visiting with the baby Jesus instead of 3, and which is perfectly fine with me because there were more than 3 anyway. And it came to the part where the wise men laid down their gifts in front of Jesus, and then they left. And at the end of the sermon, after the program was all done, the youth minister was kind of picking things up, and he noticed that Michael's gift was still sitting on the ground in front of the manger. And so he hollered at Michael. Michael was at the back of the church. Of course, everybody was hugging him and thanking him for being up on stage because he'd never done anything like that before. And the youth minister walked up to him and he had that gift in his hand, and he said, Michael, he said, this is yours. You brought it. You took a lot of effort into putting this together. He said, I want you to have it back. And Michael looked at him and he said, I don't want it back. I gave it to Jesus. I haven't heard this story in 20 years, and it still makes me cry. So the youth minister took it back to his office after everybody had gone, and he opened up the box, and inside this box was a letter. He opened it up, and it had been stained by tears over the years. And the youth minister opened it up, and he started to read it. And it said, Michael, he said, I'm glad your mother is finally dead. It means I have no ties to you anymore. I don't have to worry anymore. I never wanted you in the first place. You were a huge disappointment to me. Don't ever call me. Don't ever write me. I don't want to see you again. And it was signed by Michael's father. Every one of us in this room has something that we need to give to Jesus. True worship involves all the things I talked about this morning, but true worship also involves giving up those things that are getting in the way of your worship. Let's pray.